Trump himself curtailing overtime protections, workplace regulations, all these things that just sort of chip away at any kind of security or standards of the working class.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
All right, folks, you are still listening to the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison. I am joined by award-winning labor journalist Alex Press, staff writer for Jacobin Magazine. How many awards is it now at this point? Is it?
It's not that many awards. It's
not
really
that many. So multiple awards then.
I think it's multiple, but
Okay.
I can't be quoted on that.
That's
the key is if you get one, you can say award winning.
Right. Exactly. And I've started to, I don't know if I've joked with you about this, but I have been jokingly referring to myself not in very many contexts, but in some contexts as a nationally syndicated radio host, because we are on the radio in 3 states now. We're going to add a 4th in January. So I think that's
exciting.
That's something like.
Does that count as the nation? Do you have to say like multi-state syndicated? I don't know.
It is across the nation. It's more than one state.
Across the nation. Right. Yeah.
So
and just don't ask me how far across.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. From a very small portion of the station of the nation. But so really excited to have you on, obviously, because you're a staff writer at Jacobin and a labor reporter. You have been and for years now, you've been following labor very closely. And so I'm interested in and actually, somebody at Bloomberg had mentioned something. I was listening to, I think, a podcast that you were on Bloomberg, which is a very, kind of business pressy type of thing. And they talked about how, like, well, even though, she's a dirty commie, like, this is the kind of person that you want on the labor beat, because she actually kind of gives a shit about.
Is that, I don't know what podcast you're talking about now. I'm very curious. Was it Odd Lots?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they said something about it wasn't so kind of glib as I'm being.
I've been on Odd Lots and brought a UAW person on there before. So
yeah, and I think in the as they were introducing you, maybe to kind of calm the fears of their business audience, they were like, look, she's the one that she cares about this stuff. So she's like, the socialists are going to be one of the only people who actually do good labor reporting. So
yes, I find in the business press, I often get that caveat and then also explanation where they're like, but that's why it's worth reading, because who else would be doing this?
Exactly.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that it's very frustrating seeing like the people that most papers have reporting on labor stuff. Like here in Alabama, our paper of record, AL.com, the business reporter is the person that always reports on labor stuff. And it's like he doesn't know anything about about like the NLRB or the NLRA or unions or how any of it works. And it's just, ultimately it's not super material most of the time to the reporting, but it's like a labor reporter wouldn't have made that mistake about the NLRB process.
Yeah. I mean, there's also just a basic kind of it infects the coverage in that there's always thinking not only of the business side, but like this matters based on how it's going to affect consumers versus the idea that like the workers themselves are a contingent of the public and you might be kind of writing towards their perspective or something like that. Like it really does infect all of the kind of downstream coverage. But that is where things are at now. That usually it's the business reporter.
Yeah. And so I guess for the last year and we can go further if you think that there's a broader point to make over the last, 5 to 10 years or something. But over the last year, what do you feel like are the most consequential stories that have been happening in the labor world and by consequential, meaningful in the immediate like as they are happening to an amount of people, but also what were some of the stories that are going to have the most lasting ramifications? Like what are we going to be talking about next year or in 2026 or in 2028?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is not just like the UAW's new organizing campaigns, but just generally the democratization of the UAW. I think, which has various effects. There's the new organizing of non-union auto plants, particularly in the South, which we can go into, some losses, some successes, some not yet trieds. But there's also, the UAW's democratization has led to labor having this kind of more prominent voice than it used to, even before, Sean Fain, just a couple years ago, before he was the head of the union. It's interesting. The UAW has always had this kind of pace setting role in U.S. labor, for better and for worse. In the 20th century, it very much was, if once the UAW was winning strong contracts in auto, there were knock-on effects so that, blue collar jobs writ large started having better benefits, better wages to keep up with the competition so that workers wouldn't flee to go work in auto. And it's interesting that once again in the 21st century now, kind of the reformed UAW is having this outsized, kind of voice. Sean Fain is speaking at the DNC or whatever. It just seems like there's now a kind of body that even the mainstream that is fairly hostile to unions, kind of the legitimacy of the UAW is hard to dispute. And so it seems like that has had its own effect. There's also the higher ed organizing. That's not just UAW, actually is a range of unions. I think that, though it's not as kind of strategically central as, a lot of kind of manufacturing work or even healthcare sector work, I think the higher ed workers, the fact that they have such incredible momentum, grad students. I was just on a panel with a student in the University of Pittsburgh grad union in Pittsburgh, and they had just won their contract in November, and it was a 97.5% vote in favor of unionizing. Which is like crazy, right. And that's also true of adjuncts and other faculty. And, with those workers, I think it's interesting in that they're raising kind of the policy questions and the political questions around the role of the university and, the privatization of, universities writ large, turning them into like real estate endeavors that happen to have teaching on the side. So I think that stuff might be significant down the road as far as like what those coalitions of unions are trying to push for at the political level. At least that's my hope.
Actually, if we could, let's stop on that for a while, because that's fresh on my mind, because one of the things that we talked about on our show yesterday was the Vanderbilt grad union withdrew their election petition. Just last week, with the UAW, they had filed an election petition, and citing the new Trump administration as well as a judge's ruling against the election proceedings. There was a federal court judge that ruled against Vanderbilt being forced to give the typical personal information that a union gets when they file for an election. I don't think that the federal judge officially said these are not workers, therefore they're not eligible for unionization, but they said because of some other law relevant to higher education, they do not have to comply with the NLRA, which says that you have to give the information to the union when there's a union election. And so citing that and the likely not friendly Trump NLRB, right, they just withdrew their petition. And so, are we going to see, in 2017, we saw a lot of that too, grad students deciding not to go through with an election. Are we, but to a certain extent, right, the cat's out of the bag, and there are now, 80,000 grad student union members? More than there were in
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the number. It feels like everyone it's like such a wave. But yes, the cat is out of the bag, in 2017, you're right. Yeah. I remember, I was part of organizing a grad union at Northeastern University in Boston. And in that era, I think that would have been 2017, 2016, that we were just getting started. 2016, 2015. Yeah, it was such a live question because you didn't want to give the NLRB, you didn't want to give it a chance to set a precedent that, this is why there's so many stupid things in this country, obviously. But the fact that the NLRB flips every 4 years and then they just undo precedents, they're actually, this is a huge problem. And certainly for the grad unions, this has been almost comically absurd in that every 4 years, everyone has to change their strategies to try to avoid screwing over everybody else by either setting a precedent that then gives the judges a chance to say that grad workers aren't workers, and then everyone else is kind of in jeopardy all of a sudden. I do think because these unions now have been around, as you're saying, for like some of them for 10 years, some for 2 years, like they already have momentums. A lot of them already have contracts. It is hard to see the kind of momentum flipping in the same way it was doing in 2016, 2017. And when I was thinking about like the coalitions of higher ed unions, I was also thinking a lot about faculty. There have been various pushes around funding for public universities, around kind of reining in the real estate speculation and endowments that these universities prioritize. Obviously, there's been organizing around the investment in companies that profit from the war on Palestinians. There's all this stuff that I think is already in the works that I'd be curious, in part because these people have, the thing about white collar workers that kind of sometimes bugs people is they're like, these people are kind of bourgeois. Like these are well educated, often from like, sort of more upper class families. And it's like, that's totally true. And also makes me wonder if that means they actually will be able to kind of shift some policies now that they've organized themselves to try to, take back higher education, which, it affects all of us, the fact that it's become such a money-making scheme. And so that's one thing. I mean, again, that's a small thing in the writ large as far as labor stories, but I think it's worth talking about. And so, non-union auto, this is a question. I'm curious what it looks like from where you're sitting, Jacob, because obviously a lot of these efforts have been in the South. Volkswagen, Mercedes, these are places that, the UAW has been focused in on, even though there's other shops in Indiana and, of course, the giant Tesla plant in California that need to be organized. But so far, the focus has been in the South. So I'm curious if you think these things if those efforts have legs. The UAW certainly has committed money and organizers and time to doing this, and certainly needs to do it if it wants to survive. We have half of auto workers in this country are non-union now. And that's just going to get worse as, EV sector grows unless the unions can organize them too. So I'm curious what you think, Jacob, about those campaigns.
Yeah, I think that obviously there are legs. They're kind of definitionally are legs because they have they've committed so much money to the effort, right?
Right.
I mean, there's a certain level of foundation that just allocating $20 million gives a campaign.
That's true.
Right? But it's, I guess I have been disheartened would be like too strong of a word,
yeah.
I think, but I have been disappointed by the lack of kind of self-organization among some of these non-union automakers, because I know that is I think that was something like the explicit hope when they threw out when they threw out all of these cards and they say, hey, you work for Toyota, sign this card. You work for Rivian, sign this card. You work for Mercedes, sign this card. They had a whole page about it, and I think there was some hope that like we throw open the doors and they're going to come rushing in, and unfortunately we just have not seen that. And so that's been very, very disappointing for me, I think, seeing that there's not just this wave of people that are clamoring to unionize, and it's going to take work. It's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I asked, because it felt like in the immediate months, when I think about these campaigns that actually got to National Labor Relations Board votes, the Mercedes plant in Alabama lost. But very much, part of the story there was, I remember, I don't know if you talked to him yourself at all, but that guy, Jeffrey Kimbrell, who is like the powerhouse worker in that plant, who became like this incredible organizer. And from the outside looking in, and certainly I talked to Jeremy and other people in the UAW, they're like, our organizers were nothing compared to Jeremy and the kind of other core of the organizing committee. And they still lost. At Chattanooga at the Volkswagen plant where they won, which was before that, that was, so Mercedes, the loss was in, I think, May, and I think the win in Chattanooga was April. it seemed at that time like there was momentum. Like, yeah, they lost at Mercedes, but this is yet another kind of worker-led effort where people just were committed to doing it. And so the UAW correctly was like, okay, let's support this effort and give it a good try. But there haven't been live campaigns since then. There are certainly campaigns like, the EV plants seem to be a little more complicated. There certainly are campaigns in the works in some of these states, but there have not been public campaigns the way that these two were, where it was like at 30% of workers having signed cards, you were having public rallies and kind of the campaign getting like really moving and aggressive and going to war with the politicians in these states. And again, that's 7-8 months ago. So yeah,
they did announce.
It's a bummer.
Yeah, I mean they did announce, and like they had videos when Hyundai in Montgomery got 30% and Toyota in Troy, Missouri hit 30%.
Yes.
But yeah, since the Mercedes thing, it's all kind of I still talk to people like at Hyundai, and I'm still hearing some things from some other places, and it's not as if there's nothing happening, but there's a certain level to which like the progress has stalled. And certainly politically the environment is not getting any friendlier.
Right. I mean, I think that's the thing is that, the whole campaign being predicated on like at 30% we're going public is so unusual, right? Like you usually want to try to get, you don't want anything and you certainly don't want to file or anything like that until you have a super majority. And so that's the only thing is clearly you couldn't do that at many of these places, and that's why they haven't started kind of going public, and not just the videos, but like public organizing towards a date, filing for an election. And it's too bad, but it always seemed to me like it was a real, there was a hope that this would work, but it always seemed like a long shot. So I imagine now it's more like traditional campaigns of like slowly building. Where that will go, I think it's hard to predict because, as you said, the environment is now getting worse very, very quickly with Trump's election. It feels like the kind of mood has shifted from people thinking things are possible to people being fairly demoralized. Obviously, that's painting with a broad brush. I don't mean that nobody is like still trying to organize, but it feels, I'm worried that people are starting to hunker down a little bit rather than keep outlaying resources and time and kind of hope in growing organization. So that's I think still significant for sure as far as what we've seen this year that will be worth talking about. And then, we talked about the Amazon strike with the Teamsters. I think, the Teamsters organizing at Amazon and just more generally, the question of Amazon workers writ large and how they're organizing themselves. Those efforts now have been ongoing for like 5-6 years in some places. Some many they've just started in the past year. I think it's just impossible to, even if the number of workers organized and the kind of progress is very minimal so far. Like, I don't think you could possibly be covering the working class in America and not list Amazon as one of the most significant kind of entities where the future might be decided, because it is such a gigantic employer and a monopoly in so many ways. So obviously, I think that story is very significant.
I was talking
Amazon
to somebody,
workers. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody about the Amazon strike yesterday, and they were asking about like the risks, and my assumption of kind of some of the reasons that they were doing it. I mean, obviously they didn't think that this was going to be enough economic pressure to push Amazon to the table, although that was some of the stated stuff, and no doubt they want to put pressure on Amazon, and there's going to be some felt from this, but it's not going to be enough in and of itself to get them to the table. And so my thoughts were that some of the other reasons unstated were that presumably these people that went on strike are going to be able to go back to work, and hopefully that would instill confidence in them individually, but also in other people around the country that see these people that took a pretty kind of daring action, right? And were able to get back to work. So what do you make of that? I mean, does that sound right? And maybe the cat can let us know what she thinks.
Sorry, I had to grab the cat. He was about to jump onto the computer. So everyone, this is Moose, who is still a kitten, as you can see. Hopefully he will now that I've given him attention, he will go away. I didn't want to start disappearing from the screen. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That like at the level of like Amazon is still so early stages that it really does matter that you have like 50 or 100 workers in a shop that now have confidence and have like taken action. That is like really extraordinary. I mean, we know this is not a majority strike. This is not putting enough pressure that Amazon really is going to come to the table yet. And yet at the same time, like, you know, if you're a worker at Amazon, like, the fact that you actually struck, and if you're going back to work afterwards, it's just like, it's revolutionary. It feels like you've just, I mean, you watch you talk to the workers, you stand with them outside on the picket line. They can't believe they're on, like, that they're telling their bosses to like go, you know, that they're like standing up to them. I was watching workers taunting their bosses, and one was saying, and the manager was trying to be like cool and friendly, like, you know, kind of dismissing what they were doing. And the worker said, like, if you think we're going to be cool after this, you don't understand what we're doing here. He's like, it's all different now. You don't come back from making us strike in the winter. I mean, it's 20 degrees out in New York right now. And so that kind of stuff actually is significant, I think. So to your point, exactly right. I think these workers understand it's a long fight. People have just seen it at JFK 8, where again, like, these are indisputably employees who don't have the kind of legal problems that these drivers have. And they also haven't been able to get Amazon to the table and get Amazon to bargain or recognize them whatsoever. So I think, you know, the fact that the Teamsters are trying to get serious and putting, again, resources and like time and energy into this, I think, again, if we're listing like what are the stories that matter, both like what will we remember a few years on, and also what will be part 2 and 3 and 4 that we're talking about a year from now, I think that's another one that obviously has to be on the list.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate. What do you make of the letter carriers? What do you make of their contract struggle and some of the some of the rank and file revolt against the tentative agreement from the union? Do you think that that's going to, there are potentials for lasting impacts there, or do you think that this is going to be kind of isolated into that union?
I don't know, because, okay, so for folks who don't know, you know, they had a tentative agreement in the fall, and there was almost no raise to the wages. It was like 1% a year. Tiers were still there. And usually the letter carriers, like these contracts vote, they pass no problem. They're ratified, you know, without much dispute. This year, there's been like a real kind of rank and file outrage and pushback around this bad contract. So they're voting. I think their ballots are back sometime next month. And there's been sort of a real grassroots organizing effort there. As to whether it's going to like have momentum, you know, whether they're going to actually vote it down, and even if they don't vote the contract down, whether this will be the start of like maybe yet another reform caucus like we've seen in the UAW and in IATSE and in a few other places. I don't know. I mean, I hope so. It's certainly unusual that they even have this much, even that workers have this much kind of outrage around things. But that is a story that I actually have not really been able to, I haven't dug into it too much. You know, part of the context of why I don't know that and why I keep asking you things is I'm in the midst of writing a book about the past few years. So I've had to stop figuring out new stories. I've had to start tracking the old ones and catching up with them. And so that's one that I really, you know, when I run into folks, that's one that people are talking about a lot, though.
It is interesting. There is a caucus that has been formed. Obviously, remains to be seen
right.
what kind of staying power it has. But something that I have noticed putting stuff out online is that and it makes sense, but the transportation sector unions have a very, very lively, like, online kind of media ecosystem within themselves, right? Like when I started covering some of this letter carrier stuff, I became aware of a podcast that is in the top 100 podcasts on Reddit. Like, it has one of the most active subreddits on the site, and it's just a letter carrier podcast. It's about how to do and it started about like how to do grievances good, and it evolved into more of like an internal union politics thing. But yeah, it's huge. It is.
Can you say what it is? Give them a plug so I can listen to it.
From
do you know
A
what it's
to
called?
arbitration. From A to arbitration.
Oh, that's great.
Is the name of the podcast. And yeah, it's enormous. And there's there's this guy, Everything USPS with JH. He's a postal worker, and he has a big, he drives an 18-wheeler or something. And then after he gets off work, he throws on his webcam, and he gets like 3, 4, 5, 7, 10,000 views every video. They're just talking about the Postal Service. And the Teamsters had a very similar thing with UPS, there's the Roswell hub, there's and then there's some other things that and it's not affiliated with TDU necessarily. I think there's some alignment there, but
it's funny. I discovered this network within UPSers actually at the prior contract negotiation that in 2016 or 2018, I can't even remember anymore. God, we're getting up there in age, where I wrote an article for the Washington Post, basically, it's not my job to tell workers how to vote on a contract, but basically saying this is a bad contract and explaining what tiers are. And I found out about this because there was a rank and filer who, as far as I understand it, was not really involved with TDU or anything, who had a very popular among his fellow UPSers YouTube channel. And he on the YouTube channel just read my article out loud and was like, this is right, this is correct. And all of a sudden I was getting contacted by all of these UPS rank and filers. It was like the most convenient thing in the world for me. And I was like, where are they coming from? And it was from that guy's YouTube channel.
Was it the Roswell hub?
I don't think that's what it was. I can't remember exactly. I should remember, but it was so long ago. Anyway, yeah, you're right. I mean, I think this also leads into the other like elephant in the room, which is like, what will a Trump administration do and mean, and how's it going to change and affect these things? And certainly, the stuff Trump's been saying about, I'm going to privatize the post office. This is relevant to that.
I just had and so with our contract, with our Postal Service contract coverage, we've picked up a lot of letter carriers, and some of them conservative, and some of them called in after the election and were like, we're super pumped. And I was like, what do you think about Trump wanting to privatize the Postal Service? This is before the most recent thing. And he was like, he doesn't want to do that. And I was like, no, he put out a plan in 2018 to do it from his Office of Management and Budget. And he was like, oh, I didn't know that. I don't think he really wants to do it. And so, so he called back in. He called back in after this most recent story. And he was like, yeah, that's really bad. I'm going to be trying to talk to my representatives. And he talked about how, their union has had Democrats come and talk to them about why letter carriers should vote for them. And he has tried, because he's a Republican letter carrier and active in his union, he's tried to get the Republicans to come, and they won't come because they don't care, is my interpretation. He didn't say this, but I say they don't care about letter carriers, and they particularly don't care about union letter carriers. And so it was just, it was interesting, seeing him kind of think through that and be like, I don't want us to be privatized. It would be bad. Presumably I would lose my pension, and like agreeing with kind of the things that I talked about with the problems with privatization. And so, I don't know. It's going to be that'll be an interesting fight if Trump really goes to the mat on that. I think it'll have a hard time getting through Congress, especially with the dynamics of the Postal Service, like really a subsidy for rural America, and rural America being so conservative. So I think it would have a hard time passing, but, I don't know. We'll see.
And even if there's an attempt, though, I mean, it sort of puts a very high profile fight into one of, also the union, like the Postal Workers Union itself is so important. It's historically been like incredibly important for Black workers as like, kind of lifting people's like wages on average in certain communities, like all of this stuff, and wildcat strikes in the 70s at the postal workers being like this catalyst that kind of inspired a lot of other workers, and even in the private sector. I feel like a fight front and center that involves both letter carriers, postal workers, like that would be interesting. I hope you're right that it couldn't actually pass. But it does bring to mind like the specter of a high profile battle like Reagan and the air traffic controllers, and then of course there's other stuff like we're going to have a management side NLRB all of a sudden, conservative rulings. Who knows how much that's going to matter? It's certainly not going to help things. Trump himself, just like in the first term, there was stuff around curtailing overtime protections, workplace regulations, all these things that just sort of chip away in a less dramatic sense any kind of security or standards of the working class, especially public sector, but also, private, as far as we're thinking about the NLRB rulings. So I think that's bad. I think that's not going to, and then there's this sort of vibes that I was talking about with the UAW campaign. Like the feeling actually matters too. And I feel like the Trump election, the feeling has changed of people being ambitious and feeling like they can win. I think these things are actually, I don't normally talk like that, but I feel like when I'm speaking to workers all across sectors, there's like a defeatism, like people feel defeated. And whether that's going to affect things, I mean, I'm certain it will. Hopefully, what I'm saying is like just the dark view. And obviously, as people are under attack, they fight back. My hope is that, the fact that Trump is so attacking so many types of people and types of sectors and types of workers would force everybody to actually be working together, which obviously historically for the American labor movement has not been a strength. And so, for example, you think about the mass deportations, this is a labor issue. How do unions respond to that? And I don't know. Certainly, the mainstream unions will say that they oppose this and that they want to fight on this. What it's going to look like if those plans actually come to fruition from the Trump administration, I don't know. I couldn't pretend to know how labor is going to respond.
Yeah, and we're moving into kind of the 2025 conversation. Obviously, there were other stories in 2024. I mean, Starbucks, the longshoremen, and I think the longshoremen it'll come up pretty quickly in 2025. Definitionally. In January, the contract extension is up, and so we're going to see if they get a deal or not, and if they're going to have to strike again. But talking about just the kind of vibes and the vibes of defeatism that people are the concern that people are having from the Trump administration. The fact that you're hearing that from workers is an interesting juxtaposition in my mind to some of the folks that kind of are on the left, I think, like, the Young Turks and Cenk Uygur that are kind of trying to make the case that there's going to be some bad things for sure, like particularly on immigration and on social issues, but like this is a new MAGA is what he's calling it, and it's like right-wing populist, and it's going to be great, and we're going to be able to do some good things for workers. We're going to maybe be able to cut the Pentagon. We're going to be able to maybe tax the rich and do some things like this, and so like. What do you make of the fact that there are some people it seems like trying to make this happen or wish this into existence? Like, is there anything, any tea leaves that you're seeing that would lead you to have confidence in the kind of pro-worker conservatism a la J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, and presumably Donald Trump that some people are trying to say there is?
I mean, the short answer is not really, right? I mean, it's very strange and so stupid to talk about. I feel bad for anybody who has to listen to this, but like people, the only things I see as possibly being a motivation for pro-worker policy or changes or anything are like owning the libs. So I can imagine like, Hawley and Trump passing, like supporting something that, a one-off, whether it's for that particularly helps the Teamsters or, particularly helps a blue collar, particularly white guy kind of sector. Maybe it's manufacturing. I don't know. I mean, it's ironic because Trump himself has stiffed like construction workers in his own jobs. Like I could see something like that just for the sake of being able to then say, see, we're pro-worker. Right. But the actual commitments here are like they don't exist, and there's no basis for it. Josh Hawley, for example, who's like, so phony that like, workers in his state often talk about him changing into like, his blue jeans before he comes and joins the picket line. And they know that's like, he only keeps those blue jeans to wear on the picket line. Otherwise he's like a, fancy Ivy League guy. Like he may, he's saying things because he's courting these votes, whether it's from like the sort of Teamsters or especially, or kind of other fragments that, of the media that are trying to push this stuff, the MAGA populism. Like he'll say he supports whether it's joint employer status for like companies like Amazon, things like that. Like these people will sometimes say things for the sake of like owning the libs again or owning the left, people like me. But then you look at their votes and it's just like, they're undoing the very things they're pretending to support, whether it's who they're backing for, appointments in the Trump administration, whether it's their records on the actual votes and policies and legislation that would create, whether it's joint employer status or any other kind of worker power. Like it's easy to say these things because then you get a news cycle out of it saying like, look how pro-worker the new right wing is. But like, talk is cheap, right? This is the saying. And the votes just don't back it up. I find it frustrating because it feels like people want to be a sucker. I just wish people had a little more like respect for working people, not to mislead them in this way.
The Holly thing has been this week particularly frustrating because he just got a news cycle out of like ostensibly advocating for joint employer when literally the week before he voted against reconfirming Lauren McFerrin.
Yes.
And like I made that point on Twitter and Zaid Jilani and it got enough, it got enough traction that Zaid Jilani found it. And he was like chastising me about, ultimately the NLRB vote was not super meaningful. We'll see. He wants a Republican to appoint a pro-worker, person to the NLRB. And so we'll see what happens there. But like, we have no reason to expect that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so, like, what do you mean the vote for the NLRB is not meaningful? Like, if just one of these people, if Holly had switched his vote, we would have a pro-worker NLRB. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean?
I mean, people like that. I mean, he in particular just seems like a dumb guy. Like he just has no idea, again, what he's talking about on the subject, which makes sense. It's not like it takes a lot. Right. It's really hard to figure out this stuff and to like the labor beat is not like super accessible all the time. Right. Like but you got to know your lane if you're going to speak up so much. That said, I think there's another layer here beyond like these people being phony in this way, which is like, I was talking to people after Trump won who like, we were talking about some article, right? Of course, we know that union members did vote Democrat at a higher percentage than the general public, but it is the case that some workers are being won to the right wing and to Trump. And that's just a fact. And a friend and I, and the friend is queer, we're talking about this. And she's like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I'm not saying like screw workers. She's like, I think these people like hate me more than like, than the other, like, she's like, I think that's what's motivating them. And look, I'm a worker too. And this is really splitting my ability to organize with people. And I think that's happening in locals. I think that's happening across unions. I think that's happening in particular geographic locales. Like this entire moment is about, it really is dividing the working class in this way that I think has extremely pernicious consequences when it comes to fighting back on anything. If workers are not, I feel like the theme of the past few years, and not at all because of Biden, I think in part because of the conditions of the pandemic mostly, was a question. It felt like people were like purposely trying to be more unified and reach across not just unions, but sectors and demographics, kind of understanding that like we need everybody if we're ever going to be able to flip the momentum against capital. And it feels like this moment, the fact that we're even talking about like, is Josh Hawley pro-worker? I'm just like, we are now moving so far from the idea that like, no, the workers actually have to organize against all of these people who are taking their money and their livelihood and their ability to actually live. It just feels like now there's so much recrimination. And I think it's totally fair. Like to the friend in question, I was like, I don't think I can argue with you. Like if you say you don't care about these people and you think they're motivated by hatred of trans people, like I think you have a point there. Like I'm certainly not going to tell you you're wrong. And so that sucks.
Yeah, I think I mean, for sure, there's some of that, and that is particularly frustrating to me because, like, I came from a socially conservative background, very, very socially conservative. In fact, like, the social politics were the only politics that mattered to my family, and they were very much that way. And so when I first voted in 2016, I assumed that I was going to be voting in the GOP primary for president. But I also knew that I didn't really know anything about politics, particularly economics, and like I cared about stuff like that. And so like I watched the debates, I started reading, I started trying to figure out, and like I was immediately convinced on the economic argument. Like I was immediately like, oh yeah, why would I give more money to rich people and expect them to like give it to me for some reason? Like, no, we should just have the government take it. Like, I was super convinced, like, totally. And so like I voted for Bernie Sanders, even as I still also believed that gay marriage should be illegal and abortion should be illegal, and thinking that Black Lives Matter was like very, very scary, right? And so like I've had that space, and I cared more about making the minimum wage higher and getting people health care than I cared about these other things, because ultimately, even though I had policy preferences in these social lanes, it's like, I think it's more important that people have health care than gay people can't get married. Like, it just, and so it's very, very frustrating for me that there are people that have the opposite thing, that there are people that do care more about trans people not being able to be trans than they care about their union.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, I think it's just, it's the conservative machine in the media, and it's certainly the Trump project is like, this sort of the simplistic kind of dogmatic way to describe it is like the ruling class uses social issues to fragment people and distract them from the economics. And of course, that's like a little simplified, but like, it's not wrong. That's basically correct. And like, Sanders was great in that, not because he's perfect or whatever, but like he was really good at saying like, no, that stuff, he basically thinks that, right? He basically said, these things are meant to divide you. What matters is that you all have health care and like a living wage and unions and stuff. And like, that was a winning argument and very useful for those of us on the left who want to organize people. It feels like people are now being disorganized. And as I said, like the division, and that is a problem. Like, that really is going to be, it's frustrating. It's certainly dangerous. And like, it sucks to see people being used as suckers in this way, is how I feel about it. So I guess that probably covers what the next year looks like, which is like, there's going to have to be a lot of work done that I think it didn't feel like had to be a priority, or maybe, in a different way it was a priority. And now there's just like momentum towards dividing people that you now have to spend a lot of time and energy trying to counter.
Right.
Yeah.
Alex Press, award-winning journalist, staff writer at Jacobin Magazine. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.